And hello and welcome back to everyone else. But to today's training industry leader talk, Prove It, measuring the impact of learning, sponsored by Biz Library, Litmos, Open Sesame, Webfix, We Learn, and Skooks. So I'm Liz Spate, the events marketing specialist here at Training Industry, and I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. So similarly, like our other sessions, I'd like to quickly go over a few housekeeping items to help you interact with our speaker and get the most out of today's program. So throughout today's event, specifically this session, if you can put your questions in the chat, that will help us and our speaker navigate those questions and be able to address them almost simultaneously. So we would appreciate that. But if you have any bigger overstanding questions, you can totally put that in the Q&A as well. We would also love to hear about what you've learned from today's session on social media. So please follow at Trading Industry and share your favorite takeaways with your colleagues. And like I mentioned, we will have a survey at the end. So please let us know how each session is doing, what your thoughts, what you loved, what you liked, all the good things. And then all of our sessions are being recorded and will be archived on trainingindustry.com. And you will receive a follow-up email from us today with those links. If this is your first training industry event, we would love to welcome you. We exist only to make connections among learning and development professionals. We offer tons of resources to support your role in L&D, like through live events like today's Leader Talk. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. Jill Stefaniak is the Chief Learning Officer at Litmos. Her interests focus on the professional development of L&D professionals and instructional design decision-making. She also serves as an associate professor in the Learning and Design and Technology program at the University of Georgia. Now, this content represents the opinion of Jill, and it carries no endorsement of the University of Georgia. But with that, it is my pleasure. Take it away, Jill.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm looking forward to talking about one of my most favorite topics to talk about when we think about learning and design, as well as one of the most challenging topics that we often are faced with as L&D professionals, which is thinking about the relationship between our L&D efforts and how we're able to demonstrate ROI. And more importantly, what are those metrics that matter most when we're engaged in these types of conversations with our organizational leadership, as well as with our stakeholders. So what I'm hoping to do for our chat today is to really kind of just provide that overview and think about what is ROI in L&D, what does it look like? Talk about some metrics that matter. What are some metrics that we can try and infuse in these discussions when we're trying to demonstrate our worth within the organization? And then also just some of my predictions of where I think we're headed in terms of what ROI might look like in the next couple of years here in L&D. One of the things I want to preface, I engage in a lot of conversations with L&D professionals working in a lot of different organizations, and ROI and evaluation always tends to come up as one of those challenging topics that we're regularly faced with. And so, like most instructional design responses that I have when I'm talking to different individuals, my answer is usually it all depends, because everything is so contextualized and everything is uniquely situated in the organizations and settings that we're working within. But at the same time, when we think about things like evaluation, or we think about things even like needs assessment, all of these efforts can be scalable. And so my takeaway for today is that hopefully everyone here can kind of leave with some ideas about what are some metrics that they can gather now, and then what are some ones that you can aspire to gather in the future. I think a lot of L&D professionals feel a lot of pressure with how do we ensure ROI and how do we tell that story to leadership. But I do think that it's something that we can do that's scalable over time. So for those of you, if this is something new or you're facing a lot of challenges with how you're gathering evaluative data and how you're using it when engaging with your executive leadership team or your stakeholders, I definitely think we can approach this topic in small steps depending on where we're at within our organizations. And so one of the things just to be thinking about is when we think about ROI, it's very important Looking at the evaluative data that we can gather within our organizations helps us to ensure that learning initiatives are contributing to broader organizational objectives. And so when we think about evaluation in L&D, we carry that out in a lot of different ways. If we're designing e-learning modules, we might be infusing knowledge checks throughout the module. We might be having some summative assessments at the end. We might have, depending on the nature of our business and what we're doing when we're designing instruction, there may be tests and exams at the end, depending on what the goals were for that learning experience. But when I think about ROI, I always like to picture myself taking several steps back and really looking at that 30,000 foot view of the organization. And I like to do that for a variety of different reasons, because I like to be able to visualize what are all of those moving parts going on within my organization. And then I can kind of help start to visualize, where do I see L&D interacting and touching some of those other parts, as I'm starting to think about how am I contributing to those broader organizational objectives. The other thing that when we think about ROI that's really important is to be thinking about what are the different ways we can present data and be able to make data-driven decisions to inform future programming, to be able to justify when we're putting in requests that we need to expand our L&D efforts. I have yet to meet an L&D professional that tells me that they have an unlimited budget for L&D. So oftentimes when we think about budget allocations, we're trying to demonstrate the value in what we're putting forward and how we're helping our organization and how we're helping our learners and our employees. And so when we start thinking about the ways in which we can gather data around our L&D efforts and tell that story and be able to show that trajectory of where we've seen learning and performance improved over time, that helps us when we start engaging in some of those discussions in terms of what is the future and how is L&D going to support our overall strategic plan and organizational mission, and then what are the realities in terms of budget allocations for L&D. And it also helps us to identify high value programs, as well as identify those opportunities for improvement. So perhaps we may have some programs that we haven't developed yet, but it helps to pinpoint what some of those pain points might be for our employees and learners over time. Other things that we look at is that, again, we can look at ROI to help us measure the effectiveness of what we're doing, the effectiveness of our training, the efficiency and profitability of our investments in L&D. And so again, if you think about, depending on where you work and the different types of content that you're designing, how many learners are going through it? At what point do we see learners successfully transferring that knowledge in the workplace? Again, it's one thing to be able to sit through trainings, but we need to provide enough time for individuals to be able to digest that information if they're going to be enacting change within the organization. Again, if we start thinking about how ROI measures can help measure the impact and value that L&D has within the organization, those are things that we want to be thinking about, as well as demonstrating ROI to help justify those investments, especially when we're talking to different stakeholders. One of the things that I want to preface with all of this is that there's always a lot of challenges that L&D professionals face when we start thinking about ROI. And I'm just going to get those out of the way and throw them out there today. We know that oftentimes we tend to feel that there's a lot of pressure to be able to demonstrate quick wins. And sometimes one of the challenges is that when we're looking at how we might be able to measure performance, how we might be able to ensure that there has been a change in behavior, or that performance has been improved over an extended period of time, the one variable that we don't have control over so much is time. There, depending on what the tasks are, depending on what the changes in behavior are, it takes time. Employees need to be able to digest that information, figure out how they're going to apply new skills, making sure that your organization has sufficient infrastructure in place to support these changes. All of that takes time. And so sometimes L&D professionals can tend to feel that there's a lot of pressure with, you've just designed and launched an L&D program. What are your metrics? Demonstrate your ROI, today. And that's really hard to do. Other things that we tend to struggle with and encounter challenges with is how do we quantify those intangible benefits? And so there's times where we've put together training and we know it's working well. We're hearing good things. We don't always get to see all of those benefits and be able to put them in terms of monetary terms. And so things like engagement and an improvement in employees and learners' creativity, those are things that are really hard for us to be able to capture in terms of metrics and present that as data. And so those are regular things that we're constantly facing as L&D professionals, as well as being able to isolate individual training initiatives to be able to link that directly to overall business performance. And so as we talk today and we talk about some of these metrics, things that I would strongly recommend is I'm very much a firm believer whether I'm talking about needs assessment or I'm talking about evaluation, when we're thinking about ROI and we're thinking about that big picture long term, how are we going to measure the worth and the value of L&D? How are we ensuring that our L&D initiatives are meeting its intended purpose? It's really important if we adopt this mindset of measuring twice and cutting once. And so we shouldn't be thinking about ROI after we've designed something. We definitely shouldn't be thinking about ROI for the first time after we've implemented a program. We should really be thinking about it as early as possible when we're engaged in these early conversations with leadership and stakeholders about perhaps what types of L&D initiatives we're planning on implementing. If we have any L&D professionals that are interacting with their HR or talent development departments, strategic planning committees, this is where it's really important for us to start thinking about what are those metrics that are going to be valuable to the organization, and how can L&D help to contribute to improving or enhancing those metrics over time. Again, similar to needs assessment, ROI, I'm a firm believer in scalability. And so it doesn't mean that we have to solve all the world's problems immediately with our first L&D initiative. If we're trying to gather that data, we can always expand our data collection efforts over an extended period of time. And I do think that that tends to get easier when we're talking to other stakeholders within our organization. And the more that we can communicate and explain the necessity of ROI and how much it can help other functions within the business. And so as you're going through and you're starting to think about the different conversations that you're having, perhaps with fellow L&D professionals within your organization or with other leaders and stakeholders within your organization, we should really be approaching this that we want to be tactical as well as practical in what are the realities of the metrics we have access to. And so before we kind of get started in exploring some of these things, I'm curious to hear from everyone joining us today. How are you currently demonstrating ROI of your L&D programs in your organizations? I'm seeing surveys. I'm seeing not well. Was going to say, if anyone puts in the chat that they've mastered ROI and they're not encountering any problems, just let everyone know where you work so we can all apply at some point. I'm seeing metrics from our learning management systems. Absolutely. I'm seeing showing impact on KPIs. We'll be talking about that today as well. Retention. I think retention is also really important too, especially as we're looking at the trends in the workplace these days, and we're starting to see what they're calling the great stay. Again, how are we using L&D to help support our current employees, upskill and enhance their skills so that they want to stay within our organizations as well. I'm seeing a lot of surveys. Wonderful. So one of the things that I tend to think about when we're thinking about metrics is there's a few different ways that we can dice our metrics within L&D. A lot of times when we look at metrics that are often shared or shared more frequently, it's usually how many learners is participation rates, how many learners have enrolled in a program, how many learners have successfully completed it. So oftentimes, sometimes we're relying on those attendance metrics. How many have, if you're doing anything with e-learning, have they clicked through the modules in their entirety? Have they completed those knowledge checks at the end? But if we're really looking at ROI and we're really looking at to what extent have they been able to transfer that knowledge, we sometimes tend to struggle with that information because oftentimes learners go through training and then they go back to work, and we don't always have the opportunities to follow up with them to the extent that we would like as L&D professionals. And so one of the ways we can kind of start thinking about how we might be able to categorize some of these different metrics, I'm thinking of it in terms of knowledge acquisition metrics as well as job performance metrics. And I'm seeing some of those things coming up in the chat today. So that makes me really excited. When we think about knowledge acquisition metrics, these are metrics that are really looking at to what extent have your learners acquired new skills? Have they acquired new knowledge? And so there's a few different ways in which we can do that. So we have pre and post assessments. And so these are things that we can weave into our L&D programs. We can weave them into whether it's instructor-led training or e-learning modules. But really looking at doing those pre and post assessments allows us to measure the change in knowledge or skills. And so it's really kind of looking at what did they know prior to attending training, and then what did they know, after participating in that training. Now that lets us know in terms of what different concepts have they retained. But we also have challenges with that because it doesn't necessarily let us know what concepts are they going to be able to apply successfully within their respective roles within an organization. We also have different metrics that we'll see, which are those self-reported learning metrics. So this is where participants will often rate their perceived learning experience. Sometimes I tend to refer to these as those smile sheets. Sometimes we're given a survey at the end of training. Did you like the training? Was your, trainer or facilitator, were they nice to you? If it was a face-to-face training environment, it might be like, did you like the venue? Did they have good food? Those types of things. What did you think of the content? And again, those metrics can be very helpful. And I'm not saying to get away from any of those metrics. But again, it's important to recognize that it's only telling us the story about our learners. They're doing that self-reporting in one instance of time. And that's usually immediately following a training session. What I would like to see, and again, easier said than done sometimes, depending on who our learners are and where they're dispersed afterwards. But it would be very interesting to be able to see how have your learners digested that information. And so when they go back to the workplace and perhaps they're talking to their supervisor or manager and colleagues, if they're trying to make some changes within their organization or department, to what extent do they feel that they're equipped to be able to do that? We know that there's certain tasks that we can learn. We can watch a micro learning and we're able to apply those changes immediately. And then there's other things that might take more time. Perhaps we're learning skills that are entirely brand new to us. Perhaps our department's going to have to rely on working with another department or unit within our organizations. If there's any organizational, like cultural changes or political changes due to leadership within our organizations, that can take some time too. And we don't always get to capture that information from these self-reported learning outcomes that are often gathered immediately after someone has participated in training. Other things that we can think about here too is just knowledge retention. And so oftentimes where we're seeing this taking place is through tests or quizzes that are administered after a delay to gauge retention. And usually when you typically look at a lot of those metrics, we're seeing that those are happening immediately after a particular module may have been completed. So some of the things that we can think about in terms of how can we approach these or how can we strategize some of these as L&D professionals, it's thinking about, do we have opportunities, depending on what the training is and what the learning requirements are for our employees and learners, do we have opportunities to be able to push out some micro learnings or some follow-up surveys so many months out, just to kind of see how are you doing with the information? What do you still remember from these trainings? What has been the most challenging to be able to apply in your respective roles within the organization? when we look at instructional design research, particularly research that's done on learning and work context, the transfer context is really difficult for L&D professionals to be able to address. And so again, it's just the nature of our business and how we work and what our relationships are with our learners. If I'm training a group of individuals and I'm meeting with them regularly and I'm seeing them, regularly over an extended period of time, it's easier for me to be able to see and speak to their ability to transfer that information into their respective roles. But there's times where L&D professionals will never see who our learners are. We may be developing training content for, off the shelf trainings where our customers are going to be buying that training and their employees or their learners are going to be participating in it. And so when we start to have those disconnects between the designer and that learning audience, that can be challenging for us. And so being able to start thinking about the different ways in which we can push out some follow-ups to be able to gauge their interest, I also think is really important and really helpful. Other things we want to start thinking about when we think about those knowledge acquisition metrics is depending on what your training plan is. If you work for an organization and you're establishing learning paths and learning pathways for your employees or for your learners, you can also gather a lot of those pre and post assessments, those knowledge retention assessments over an extended period of time, so that ultimately you're creating that learner profile and being able to see how is this employee performing in their training overall. And then again, a lot of that is focused more on those knowledge acquisitions. It's thinking about what are those different ways we can gather information in terms of job performance. Now, some ways we can do that is obviously through self-reported learning, where we can have the learners or the employees can report back on what's working well for them or what they're still struggling with or what they might require some additional training on. But other aspects of this that we can look at is what are those job performance metrics? How can we start being able to gather data in terms of how are they applying these concepts within their respective roles? And so when we think about the different types of job performance metrics we could be looking at, on the job evaluations. And so this is where we'll have supervisors evaluating performance changes post-training. Now, sometimes what happens is that on the job evaluations, depending on where people work, this might only happen one time per year. It could be an annual evaluation. And this can sometimes be challenging or problematic for our learners if they're expected to apply a lot of different skills. And so I think this is where ROI should not fall solely on the L&D professionals. You really have to start looking at who are those key people within your organization that are going to be instrumental and helping to discuss and tell that ROI story. Certain things that I tend to think about when looking at this is thinking about what are the different ways organizations can support ROI, especially if we're going to start thinking about those job performance metrics. One term that we hear a lot of organizations throw out there and they like to boast is they'll say that they are a learning organization. And I think it's one thing to say you're a learning organization and you're going to mandate that all of your employees go through a lot of training. It's also important that those organizations are providing time for learners to be able to digest that information, talk amongst their colleagues about what they're learning in trainings, and really being able to communicate and think about what are the best ways to be able to implement some of these changes within the organization. And so this is where, depending on the different types of L&D programs that you may be designing content for, thinking about who are those key individuals within the organization. What are some on-the-job evaluations or performance metrics that are directly linked to this? This is also really helpful for us. I know our talk today is on ROI, but if we're thinking about just how we engage in design and when we're designing content, this is also really helpful because this is where you'd want to know from some of these managers and supervisors, what are those pain points that your employees are regularly experiencing when they're carrying out certain tasks or certain functions within your organization. In an ideal world, we're going to be able to identify those, design training that's very targeted at hopefully minimizing or eliminating those challenges that they're facing. And then we'll be able to measure that and be able to show how our L&D initiatives have helped contribute to facilitating learning and improving performance. Another metric that we often see is productivity. And I saw that that was listed in the chat. as well several times by several of our attendees this afternoon. And so these are things where we're looking at speed, accuracy, and volume of work completed. And so sometimes it may be looking at, do we see a reduction in errors or mistakes? Are we seeing that, depending on the nature of work, are we seeing that tasks and different functions are being completed more quickly than usual? These are some of the different examples that we might see. How accurate are the jobs being carried out? And again, one of the challenges that we tend to have is when we go back to ROI, it's very hard to be able to isolate one particular training program to say that that is the major, the overall contributor to that improvement in productivity or performance. But I think if we start thinking about what that 30,000 foot view is and how is L&D improving and supporting several functions within your organization, it's a nice way to be able to show how this is contributing or how this is helping to contribute to those productivity numbers over an extended period of time. And so things that you would want to be thinking about if you're starting to plan new programs, or if you're looking at how you might upstep your current evaluative processes within your organization, thinking about what's that baseline data look like in terms of productivity. What are the current metrics that you have? And then you can kind of start hopefully being able to implement different training initiatives to be able to see what the numbers look like over an extended period of time. And I think too, when we think about the ways in which we engage in these conversations with our stakeholders, and we start presenting on these metrics, I think it's important to be able to give our leaders those annotated metrics, in the sense that we're presenting these metrics, but we're also letting you know what this is currently telling us. And I think it's important to start thinking about how we can present metrics, just those current ones, when they're asking us to demonstrate those quick wins and they want to see the data immediately, but also being able to show what that data might look like over an extended period of time. And so these are the conversations that I think are really important for us to be engaging in and advocating for when we're thinking about those bigger changes that we want to see within workplace performance, is recognizing it's going to take time, recognizing we need lots of people on board within our organization to support this. And what do those time intervals look like? What makes the most sense for the changes that we have going on within our organizations? When I think about strategic planning, very rarely will we see an organization focus on implementing one change and that's it. We have so many different priorities going on within our organizations, and oftentimes we can feel like we're prioritizing everything at the same time. And so it's really important that we're thinking about, and we're very methodical in terms of what are realistic time intervals over that extended period of time. Other job performance metrics that we can gather is customer satisfaction. So really thinking about who are our clients and our customers, how are they benefiting? So if you think about anyone that your current employees are interacting with in terms of whatever the goods and services are that your organization offers, getting that type of feedback too is also a good way to indicate where we're seeing the benefits of training. If we're seeing good customer service and customers are satisfied and they're happy with their interactions with our employees, that's fantastic. Those are always great metrics for us to be able to collect and present to leadership. They can also serve as opportunities for us for perhaps some baseline data if we're looking at identifying some areas for improvement, or identifying some other opportunities to develop some new L&D initiatives within the organization. We've also got here how we are calculating our overall L&D, our overall ROI in L&D. And so other examples of this can be through performance appraisals. So again, L&D working with our HR and talent acquisition folks, and really thinking about what are those KPIs that our employees are tasked with adhering to. What are those annual goals? One of the challenges I see a lot of different organizations face is that there's a lot of employees that will do goal setting with their supervisors, and they usually do that one time a year. Maybe they do it twice a year, but then different initiatives and priorities come up for the organization. And so sometimes those initial goals that they set out during their performance review get put on the back burner, and they're asked to focus in on other things. So this is a good opportunity for L&D leaders to be able to interact with your HR and talent acquisition to figure out what's the best way to be able to gather information to see what types of resources are available to employees as a result of these discussions that come out of these annual performance appraisals. Sometimes it could be speaking with the different managers and supervisors to look at if we're expecting our employees to be able to upskill and improve what they're currently doing, thinking about what different types of training resources are available to them currently, what do we currently have that can support them, as well as what can we perhaps develop to support them in the future. This is where it's really important. And if an organization is truly going to be a learning organization, then this should be woven into that strategic plan. That type of communication and collaboration is going to be expected, especially if we want to be able to start linking ROI and being able to show and demonstrate how L&D is contributing to your overall business's strategic plan. It's really important that our units aren't working in silos and that we see a lot of that collaboration taking place. So again, thinking about what are those key performance indicators. These again are those metrics that are tied directly to an individual's role or department goals. And oftentimes we see that that's done fairly well in terms of setting those expectations for employees or discussing them at those performance appraisals. But I don't always see where they're always linked back to L&D. And again, what types of infrastructure is in place to support these KPIs or expected KPIs for in the future. And so again, for organizations to start thinking about these things, thinking about if training is a priority, or figuring out how you're going to engage your employees in training, how much time are you allocating for them to participate in training. This can kind of help your managers and supervisors prioritize what some of those initiatives may be to support their units. And so again, thinking about what are those KPIs that they really want their employees to be able to focus in on, and then thinking about what is L&D's role in that, as well as what's your organization's overall infrastructure for it. So again, being able to engage in that alignment and show those connections between your different working units within your organization, that helps to be able to show how this is a concerted effort within your organization. We also have things too, as well as real-time feedback. So this is again collecting feedback in terms of performance shortly after training, which also helps us monitor immediate job performance. And I'm sure everyone here probably has a horror story where you were required to go to training and you're sitting through the training and saying, I'm never going to be able to apply any of this on my job. I either don't have the tools, the organization's not ready for this, or they sent me to training and said, maybe we'll be able to do this, next year. That's very frustrating for employees. And we know that while we may be engaged during that training session, and we may have done well on those knowledge checks and provided feedback that the content was good in terms of knowledge acquisition, that fades out over time if we're not using that information and we're not applying that information regularly. And so again, I think being able to think about what are those formal and informal ways we can gather that real-time feedback. And so this would be examples of, if anyone here on this webinar today is a supervisor or a manager, being able to speak to your employees after they've gone through training, do a debriefing session, find out what they've learned, find out, do they have any ideas for ways you might be able to improve certain functions within your units. That can also be really helpful as well. So I'd like to see, I'm trying to monitor the chat as we're going through this afternoon, but what are some examples of metrics that you're using in those L&D programs right now that you think have been most successful? For those of you, if there's anyone on the call today that feels like you've got some really good stories of where you're able to show that in ROI, what are some of those different metrics that you might be using where you're able to tie it back to those performance-based metrics? Seeing learner engagement, time to proficiency. Yep, asking if it's applicable. I think, again, I think that one's so important. I see Rebecca's typed that in the chat, just the relevance of what we're learning and making sure we have relevance in our training. That also leads to improving learner engagement when people see the value and utility in the content being presented to them. Seeing proficiency assessments, we're seeing pre and post. I'm just kind of curious with everyone on the call today. Is anyone having good luck with being able to gather data after that extended period of time with their learning audience in terms of their abilities to transfer that information? I'm seeing Chris is pointing out, sending them out 3 to 6 months. And again, as I'm seeing all of these, a lot of these metrics are going to be uniquely dependent on where you work and your organization and other goals. And so it's not a one size fits all. I like to think of ROI when we think about evaluation, and I think the same way too when I talk about needs assessment, is being able to take that 30,000 foot view to understand all those moving parts within our organization and to think about where does L&D fit within that, but also thinking about how do we tell that story. And so if you think about how would you tell the story of L&D within your organization, how are you helping to be able to show how there was a need, content has been designed and implemented, and what are those different learning supports that are put in place to support your employees and your learning audiences, and then what have been those metrics over time. And if you think about how you might be able to share and tell that learner's journey or that employee's journey within your organization, I also think that's helpful in terms of being able to discuss ROI, but also being able to stress to different stakeholders within your organization that important variable, which is time. And that's depending on what those things are. I'm seeing someone put in there that their CEO wants the quantitative data. And yes, that's why we often see our L&D professionals are reporting on the number of learners going through those trainings. But I think that anytime, whether we're able to provide those visuals, if we're able to show what those different instances are in terms of learning and engagement, I also think that that's also incredibly helpful, that we can try to weave into these discussions when we're presenting on some of that quantitative data as well. And so when we think about the future of ROI in L&D, my predictions are we're still probably going to have challenges as L&D professionals in terms of how do we gather the information that we want and the data that we want. A lot of times too, one of our challenges is just having limited resources to be able to access this data, being able to collect that data. And again, kind of just going back to that comment about, different executives wanting quantitative data only. Again, I think there's always going to be a certain extent where we're faced with those challenges with how do we quantify those intangible benefits when we're trying to show L&D's worth within that organization. I do think, though, as we're starting to see trends and developments with, especially in workplace learning, with the evolution of personalized learning and adaptive learning, as you know, and AI, I'll throw out AI today as well. I do think that we're going to see opportunities for L&D professionals to be able to leverage these types of strategies to help enhance ROI. And so when we think about personalized learning, if we look at how that's being looked at and viewed in a lot of different L&D spaces right now, this is where we're seeing more organizations are starting to focus in on developing learning paths for their employees, starting to think about what training might look like over an extended period of time. And so again, this is going beyond the traditional training that an employee might receive during their onboarding when they're immediately hired. So again, we're starting to look at what does that training look like over an extended period of time? How are we able to identify where the employee is currently at? What skills do they want to work on and improve? And what types of training are we able to provide them? And so through things like personalized learning, this is where we're starting to see where we can improve those knowledge acquisition metrics. We can link them back to other skills inventories we might have within our organizations. And again, a lot of this would be working collaboratively with our HR friends, as well as our supervisors and managers, looking at what those KPI metrics are that are so important. But with personalized learning, we're able to pinpoint and create a training trajectory for our employees that support what they need when they need it. And this allows us to be able to hopefully accelerate skill acquisition, but also skill application. And so I'm excited with this because, again, if we want to start thinking about kind of going back to the quantitative data, if we start thinking about our learners using personalized learning, we start thinking about all of those individual learner profiles we might be able to collect over time, that will give us the quantitative data that we need when we're presenting to our CEOs or our executive leadership teams in terms of what those journeys look like, and being able to show what does that look like when we're trying to improve performance? What are those key points in time where we're seeing perhaps errors are going down, or depending on what it is in terms of what the different metrics are. When we look at adaptive learning, this is where we're looking at learners using real-time data to adjust the difficulty and the content based on learner progress and performance. And so this is where we're starting to see a lot of opportunities coming out in terms of generative AI and what that might be looking like and what that role is within L&D. But if we start thinking about different ways we can use these emerging technologies, where you may have an employee going through a training program and we're able to pinpoint what their needs are, notice if they're struggling with a certain concept, to be able to push out additional content or additional supports. That's another way in which we can enhance ROI, because we're able to target and pinpoint some of those learning challenges they may be experiencing immediately and be able to provide them feedback in real time. And so this is another way where I see adaptive learning and personalized learning really working hand in hand to optimize those learning paths and reducing time spent on redundant material, and being able to focus in on providing more time for the learner to be able to focus in on their particular knowledge and skill gaps that may exist. And so again, when we start thinking about the importance of measuring L&D and what these outcomes look like, we want to be thinking about different ways that we can tell that story to support, continuous improvement by refining and optimizing our training programs. So what evaluative data is important to us as the L&D professionals to be able to continue improving our initiatives and our efforts, looking at different ways in which we can enhance employees' engagement by providing results over an extended period of time. This is where I think we're going to see a lot more conversations being had in terms of what do these learner profiles look like? How is personalized learning and adaptive learning really helping to support evaluation within L&D? It demonstrates value to our stakeholders, and again, being able to regularly measure and share those outcomes. And so I think that as we're starting to see what metrics we currently have available to us within our learning management systems, that's one thing, being able to pull that data. But I think we're going to continue to see more data being made more readily available to us as L&D professionals that we'll be able to share with HR, with managers and supervisors to provide support to our learners.
I was about to say, we just hit time. So we do not have time for Q&A. However, Jill, the chat is chatting. We have about like 12 to 15 plus questions that are going to hit your inbox. So don't worry for everybody who didn't get their questions answered. The Litmos team will have access to all of that, and we'll be reaching out to you. But this was jam-packed. So I appreciate this. Is there anything you would like to leave with the audience before we say our goodbyes?
Again, I just think scalability is key. So we don't have to solve all the world's problems today as L&D professionals. Take comfort, I think, in knowing that this is a challenge we're all faced with, and just what are those little steps we can make in small increments within our organizations.